They say that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist. I suppose that is true, but it's not always a trick he can pull off. There are still a lot of people who believe in the devil. In my opinion, the devil is one of the most obvious characters to believe in. In fact, of all the things I believe in, I think I believe in the devil the most. Sometimes the devil finds it too hard to convince people that he doesn't exist. So he changes his plan. He decides to go for the next best thing. He convinces people that he is not amongst us. He says to us, yeah, I exist, I do, but I am not here. I was in school and we were talking about the devil, as it happens sometimes. The other kids around me were rejoicing about the fact that the devil is not omnipresent. With great certainty they boasted that the devil, right that moment, was not amongst them. But how did they know? Did they know? They didn't know, I think. The devil could very well have been there at that very moment, comforting us with the idea that he would not be there to attack us. Once we let our guards down, once we think that none of our thoughts can be inspired by the devil, then he can truly inspire us. He makes us think that he, the devil, is afraid of a crucifix or a song or water that has long since dried, because then you'll be willing to listen to him, and then he will speak. Another time, also at school, we were talking about distinguishing your own thoughts from the things that come from God, because all of us back then thought we had the potential to receive special messages from God. The gift of prophecy, we thought, was standard. We just needed to figure out how to distinguish your own thoughts from those of God. And all of a sudden I said, hang on a minute, aren't we engaged in a false dichotomy? Why do we assume that there is only two places our thoughts can come from? Can't it be true that our thoughts can be inspired but not by God? It seemed like this was a novel idea to some. By who then? Somebody asked. Because some of us had temporarily completely forgotten that the devil existed at all. Because it's somehow so natural for us to assume that the devil is only ever out there in the lives of pedophiles, shoplifters, and necromancers. But he's not here with us, we think. We are baptized, some of us receive communion, so the devil does not speak to us. But that natural instinct is just arrogance. It's arrogant to think that the devil is not here with us, with you and me personally. Why would you or I be special? How do we differ from the pedophile, the shoplifter and the necromancer? We are made from the very same material. So why do you think you are so special that you get a special protection from the spirit of Antichrist? No, I will not claim that the devil is everywhere. I don't know that. But I do know for certain that he is anywhere. When we remember 9/11, we do not celebrate it. Strangely, when we remember the devil, the church often tries to claim that we celebrate it. Any book that describes the occult is instantly labeled as satanic. The church even dares to go so far as to antagonize a simple board game. Your religious authorities don't want you to think about the devil, because they themselves don't want to think about the devil. It's unpleasant, but necessary, because the devil tends to reside on the outskirts of our awareness. Unless we remember Halloween, and even then a lot of people don't remember the devil. Often Halloween is about silly clowns and lazy jump scares. It's a bit disappointing that there are no good constructive haunted houses anymore. Somebody needs to stand up and remind the world what state it's in, because it is very, very important for us to remember the devil, to contemplate his or her existence, because it matters. Because if we don't, we might sometimes literally forget about him. The devil might become an obscure background character who is ultimately inconsequential to our lives. But the scary truth is that the devil may sometimes motivate us. And if we don't realize soon enough that he too is working in our lives, we might develop sympathy for his devilish ideas. The devil can change what we find normal and acceptable. There is one thing in theology that is absurdly acceptable. If you try to study theology, you'll eventually run into one particular unacceptable idea, and you'll find that somehow everyone around you finds it to be perfectly acceptable. It's bewildering. In modern theology, both secular as well as Western Orthodox theology, Moses is at least 6 different people. The idea is that from time to time a person was born in Israel who would assume the identity of Moses. So there would be someone who was Moseskin, basically. When I first encountered this idea, I thought that it was only a thing that secular scholars were saying. I thought that this was an idea that was held by atheist theologians who didn't believe in God and all that stuff. But no. This is an idea that is taught and accepted as a possibly true doctrine in all universities. Not just secular ones. Confessional faculties also do teach as a possible, acceptable alternative to a singular Moses that there have been at least 6 of him or her. Now, there are a lot of silly theological doctrines that I think I'm justified in mocking. But this idea is just so silly that it'd be a little redundant for me to mock it. Now, I'm well aware that Genesis doesn't make the claim that it's written by Moses. And it's not really so much the authorship of Genesis that I'm talking about. That is definitely written by a handful of people. There's no debate about that at all. I'm talking about the actual law. And the law does make the claim that it's passed down to one Moses. But the theological view that I currently perceive as dominant is that the actual law itself was redacted over the course of hundreds of years, even though the law itself leaves very little room for such an interpretation. A lot of scholars seem to look at these texts that really do claim to be written by Moses or spoken to Moses, and they say, yeah, that is written by a handful of people. A couple of people were Moses. This is known as the GEPD theory. It has a nice ring to it. It sounds like a fancy type of plastic. But if you Google it, you'll find that it's a theological theory. And really, because I don't want to make content that already exists, you should Google GEPD if you're not familiar with it. But if you know what it is, then, it's obvious work of the devil, isn't it? I mean, I'm not an Old Testament scholar, or any scholar for that matter, so I can't evaluate the evidence. But that can't be right, can it? I mean, that would have massive implications. Horrible implications. Remember when I told you that Melchizedek was immortal? Well, that's a long time ago, but trust me, canonically Melchizedek is immortal, and this is not actually up for dispute. The reason that you don't hear this in church is because it's tremendously awkward. And that's also the reason why you don't hear about the multiple Moseses in church. Because it's so very silly. But it is the real official stance of most churches. A YouTuber doesn't want to alienate their audience, and the same goes for your pastor. He doesn't want you to lose your faith over a doctrine that just so happens to be silly. But if you talk to your pastor, he will affirm what I just said. GEPD, Moses is at least 6 people. Unless you belong to a congregation where your pastor doesn't need to have studied. In that case, he will reply with common sense. He'd say, that's ridiculous. Moses is one dude. Moses is one dude. I myself have talked about this with my local pastor. By accident, I want to talk about hell actually, but sometimes you get sidetracked and then you're suddenly talking about Moses. And he had studied. Now, he himself did at the time not actively believe anything with regards to the number of Moseses, I believe. He said it was a somewhat complex issue. So therefore, apparently, he hadn't taken a stance yet on the issue. And that is good, I suppose. It's honorable to admit that you don't know. I myself always feel really proud when I have the courage to admit that I don't know about something. But still, He admitted that he considers GEPD as a real possibility. That alone is already quite disconcerting. If a lot of studied people believe this theory, then maybe there's some legitimacy to it. Maybe God really could have had his reasons for sending a couple more Moseses. It might have been necessary for the same legal principles to be described differently so they would have fitted their environment better. For example, if there was another Moses today, he might have something to say about drugs. And that wouldn't truly change the law of God. God's law would remain the same with such an addition. It does make some sort of sense to look at it that way, but it also raises a lot of questions. Firstly, if there were different Moseses to adapt the law for different times, where is the Moses of the modern day? I mean, there are a lot of ethical questions that people literally don't have the answers to. So that means that we could do with another Moses. So where is this Moses? That's the first question that's raised. And my second, slightly more complicated question is, why would God adapt the law by means of deception? Why would God send someone who inherits this identity of Moses? Why doesn't he just send another prophet like Moses, instead of somewhat deceptively redacting a pre-existing work? I mean, would you accept it now if somebody claimed ownership over the books of C.S. Lewis and started editing them, claiming the identity of C.S. Lewis? Oh, now, we would never accept that. We'd tell him to leave those books alone and make his own material. You can't just edit something that means something to people. In fact, people don't even accept it when George Lucas, one man, redacts his very own work, the work of his past self. If it was morally wrong for Lucas to make the original Star Wars trilogy unavailable, why is it right for God to make the original Law of Moses unavailable? Because at some point, there was one Moses, remember? That's something we can all agree on. And the words of this Moses did at some point mean something to a lot of people. Just like the original Star Wars trilogy. But God has taken this version of the law away. He had it redacted. Just like George Lucas did with the original Star Wars trilogy. Now, the reason George Lucas made the original Star Wars commercially unavailable is something we know. Lucas considered the original Star Wars trilogy inferior to his remastered version. In some sense, he was ashamed of showing people the wrong version of his trilogy. But why would God go about doing something like that? The old law of the old Moseses wouldn't have needed to go at all. Granted, an older version of the law may or may not be as relevant as the new one that comments on modern practices and politics and stuff, but it doesn't become incorrect either. It still carries its own individual meaning because it would still be the Word of God. So therefore it would be far more sensible for God to just send another prophet who was completely separate from Moses. It's unfriendly and it doesn't make sense for God to redact the law. That's doing it the hard way. And people wouldn't have liked it. Because just like with the Star Wars remasters, people would not have been happy about the changes. They grew up loving the old law of the old Moses. So why would God do this? Also, why did God need to lie about who wrote the law at all? Why can't God just explain in the narrative that at some point somebody else became Moses? Is God the author of confusion? And why are all these Moseses jumbled up? Why can't they just succeed each other? Why can't they just each have received their own book? I mean, if somebody were to take the identity of C.S. Lewis, as I suggested a moment ago, would it make any sense for them to write a chapter between chapters? So suddenly, for example, the line "The Witch, the Wardrobe" is twice as long. That wouldn't make any sense, would it? It would make some sense if he just wrote an 8th Narnia book, because by redacting the old works of Lewis, the new Deutero Lewis would admit that he is not really at one with the original Lewis. That would mean that his identity then cannot be valid. His identity as a Moseskin would be exposed as a politically motivated silly pretense. So unless the law is a work of deception, the Moseses shouldn't be jumbled up in the way that the GEPD theory claims. They should be succeeding each other, each having written their own set of books that complement each other to show that they are written in the same spirit, to show that their identity as a Moseskin is valid. The law, however, it seems, is written as a patchwork, not as a series, because this isn't a series. The law presents itself as one piece, written only during the time of one Moses and not after. You know how sometimes on the internet people have theories about how things are, and how sometimes it's a little awkward what people think in their ignorance? Now this is kind of like that, except it's much more real. People who post about conspiracy theories are not our leaders, but theologians are. I don't really think I can feel comfortable about anything they teach, knowing that pretty much all of them think it's at least a possibility that there was more than one Moses. This is, in my opinion, a real problem. But theologians being dangerously incompetent is not truly what I fear. Because theologians ultimately don't matter. They are not really the people who shape society. It's television. I think not a church that dictates how people think and behave. So ultimately I don't really care what theologians may say. What I truly fear is that they might be right. And I don't want that to be true at all. And I tell you why that thought frightens me so much. It's because once upon a time there was a theologian called Moseskin. Obviously, like many theologians throughout the ages, he was wrong about something. The thing he was wrong about was the amount of gods that there were. Because he thought he had discovered that there are in reality 2 gods and not one. He had studied the Bible for a long time and he saw certain contradictions, as you do when you read the Bible. And the conclusion he came to was that there had to be more than one God. There had to be 2, to make up for the contradictions. It should be noted though that this was not a dualistic model. These two gods in the theology of Moseskin were not really at odds with each other, like the gods in the theology of Valentinus are. Valentinus and Moseskin are 2 theologians who are often confused with each other, because people are stupid, so that's why I'm explaining. The 2 gods of Moseskin were not a good god and a bad god, like the gods of Valentinus. Rather, they were a lower, less perfect god, and a higher, very perfect god. Obviously, he was wrong. Any theologian can guarantee you that there is one God. So this was, as you might be able to guess, an unacceptable theological position. He got excommunicated and all that, and everybody started hating him. He lost friends and he lost family, because what he said, or what he preached, was almost beyond blasphemous. People perceived his views as diabolical, because they were so silly. What's funny though, I don't think that his views on the number of gods are his worst views, because it's not inherently immoral for there to be 2 gods. The thing I'm truly bothered about are the views of his that are now orthodox. Back in the day, substitutionary theology was still heresy, and this was also another heresy of Moseskin. In fact, I believe that he is the one who popularized this, because he did get a following. That's not a misconception about Moseskin. A lot of people seem to think that he never got any following at all, but that's not true. There were places and times where it was normal to be a Moseskinite Christian. Some people were at some point raised believing in 2 gods. Imagine something as absurd as that. 2 gods. Actually, now I think of it, there was also a sect of Christianity that believed in 365 gods, so actually believing in 2 gods is still relatively tame actually. But anyhow, Moseskin was despised by many, and this is why I'm so afraid that the theologians turn out correct. Because when Moseskin thought he had discovered an astounding truth, he believed he had to tell the world, and he did. He believed that it was crucial for people to know that there were really 2 gods instead of 1. And this ruined his life. He could have lived a happy life, but he didn't live happily, because by mere accident he started believing a monstrous heresy that ruined practically all of his friendships. And I am afraid that that could maybe happen to me. Because if it is true that there are at least 6 Moseses, then I will never accept that. I think it's obvious that the GEPD theory, if it is true, makes the law into a lie. Because I don't think it's realistic to say that the law of Moses is both misleading and reliable at the same time. So if it is proven to me that the law of Moses is misleading, I can only do one thing. And believe me, this is not a thing I want to do at all. Remember, I am a person who thinks that the dietary laws are still intact. We shouldn't eat shellfish or pork. That's the thing I'm absolutely certain about. I feel very strongly that that is from God. Not even an angel would change my mind. But still, if the law of Moses is proven to be a deceptive patchwork by writers who believed that they had to change what was written, then I believe that I will have to tell everyone what bad news I found out about. Because people deserve to know something like this if it were true. Because this is huge. And I'm afraid that once I'm convinced of this GEPD theory, I'll be willing to give up anything in my life, just like Marcion. And I don't actually want that.